All right, cool. So hey everyone, my name is Antonio. I am a political science and environmental studies double major and a junior here at SU. I am a sustainability steward, as well as being involved with a couple organizations and fellowships on campus to increase voter turnout. And I'm also a field director for a US congressional campaign based in Austin, in the North Austin, Waco area. So today we'll be talking about environmental politics in America, specifically with this year, such an unusual year. Things are not looking great from an environmental perspective. And so we're going to be addressing these things like the fact that we're in a sixth mass extinction, thanks to about 68% of biodiversity being lost in the last 40 years. And then just this year, we had the major bushfires in Australia, as well as the major fires in California and the couple of hurricanes we've already had, thanks to, or stronger hurricanes than usual, thanks to the warming waters in the Gulf. And, as an individual, as a 20-something-year-old student, seeing these things can often be pretty daunting. They can be really intimidating because it's, what can I do? I'm just sitting here reading articles and, recycling when I can, but what am I supposed to do against these, life-threatening environmental catastrophes? And the short answer is the minimum you can do is to vote. So the history of the environment in American politics is actually pretty short. There's been some environmental legislation passed in the 60s and 70s, but nothing really relating to climate change itself, the existential threat that it is. So as of today, about 2/3 of Americans think that the United States government is not doing enough to combat climate change. And statistically, that's a pretty significant amount of people, especially considering how polarized and divided we are right now. So these are a couple of Pew Research polls, which is a respected pollster that focuses on issues. And in the 2016 race, about 52% pointed out that the environment was a top issue for them, which is a significant portion, but is also still below things like the economy and terrorism and foreign policy. And then with this year, that number decreased to 42%. However, I think that's pretty understandable considering the multiple crises that we're facing with COVID-19, racial injustice, things like that. But having about half of all Americans considering this such an important issue is new. This is a new phenomenon. Rhetoric concerning climate change and global warming has really only been around since about 2000. When it was first brought up on the presidential campaign by the environmentalist Al Gore. But of course he lost, which did not bode well for the environment as an issue in American politics. So for the next 4 to 8 years, it was essentially ignored. There was some talk about removing the threat of, or the dependency of foreign oil on Saudi Arabia from the United States, but that was essential. That was about it. It wasn't until Obama's campaign in 2008 that climate change was brought up again, and it was talked about a pretty significant amount, especially in all three debates. Moving on from that, from the 2016 race, it was discussed some, but there were other issues, especially related to Donald Trump, that took precedence over environmental issues. Now, having an issue go from essentially not being interested in by the public to having half of all Americans care about within a 20-year period is pretty impressive, especially in the last 4 to 5 years. Environmental politics has gotten a lot more aggressive. And the reasons for this are for the Paris Climate Agreement, which was negotiated in 2015, the Green New Deal, which came out in 2018, and then the election of Donald Trump, who is an open climate change denier. So these three issues coupled together have really propelled the environment to the forefront of American politics. So I included this quote by Senator Bernie Sanders because it really encapsulates this new aggression that is present within politicians towards climate change. It was really the last 4 or 5 years that it's started to be treated as this existential threat, as something more than just pollution and plastic, but as this life or death threat that will have untold consequences for essentially the next 3 or 4 and beyond generations. I included this specifically from Bernie Sanders because he was really the first person to run for the presidency in 2016 and use this kind of rhetoric surrounding climate change, which completely influenced all of the next campaigns that came after him, specifically in a 2020 race. So if you look at everyone from Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, to Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg, every single one had a comprehensive, aggressive climate plan. One in which, if any of them had been the nominee to run against a climate denier, they would have had the most aggressive and comprehensive climate plan ever put forth by a major party's presidential nominee. This kind of language, this wasn't present under the Obama administration, which historically did more for the environment than any previous administration. So getting into those 3 main issues that I talked about earlier, we're going to jump into the Green New Deal. So the Green New Deal is a kind of buzzword, and there's a lot of confusion and misinformation surrounding it. And so I just want to clear some things up. First of all, it is not a piece of legislation. It can be passed, but nothing would happen. There's nothing binding there about this resolution. So when, last week during the vice presidential debate, Mike Pence brings up how Joe Biden sides with the Green New Deal, and he's going to pass the Green New Deal. There's nothing to pass. That is a misstatement. It is disinformation. What it is a series of objectives and goals set out by Representatives AOC and Senator Ed Markey, both of whom won re-election, whose goal is to address climate change from a systemic perspective and from a top-down perspective, using the power of the federal government to address this massive planet-wide issue. So some of the specifics of this include, within 10 years, sourcing all of our country's electricity from renewable energies, digitizing our power grid, upgrading and weatherizing every building in America to be more energy efficient, and then investing and completely overhauling our national transportation sector, which is a huge portion of our country's greenhouse gas emissions. This is a very, very bold set of policies, except they're not policies. They're goals and objectives. When critics call it a wish list, they're not wrong. These are just ideas put forth in order to address a problem as wide and as big as climate change. Now, unfortunately, the Green New Deal has also been significantly demonized by a lot of centrists, a lot of conservatives and right-wingers who use this disinformation to attack their opponents. So, for example, Donald Trump said that it would take away your airplane rights, whatever that means, and cars. It would ban livestock, and that it is a thinly veiled attempt to push policies that would create a socialist society. That last quote was taken directly from a Fox News headline. None of these things are true. The words airplane and livestock, or cow, or whatever, do not appear at all within the actual resolution itself. These are all literally made up to push this narrative that this radical environmental agenda is just a plan for more government control, and they just want to make sure you can't eat hamburgers anymore or drive your car. Now, if you are someone who takes a more libertarian approach and genuinely doesn't want government within, taking control of your life, you don't want government telling you what to do at all, which is understandable, then yeah, there are some valid criticisms of the Green New Deal that could say that this is just an exercise for more government control. However, people who make that argument also are not providing an alternative. They're not, coming up with their own non-governmental solution to addressing such an issue as wide as climate change. Now, the Green New Deal, like I said, is not a piece of legislation. So what's the point? Why pass it? What a lot of people don't realize is that the Green New Deal worked. The point of it was to completely change the conversation surrounding climate change, and it did. The Green New Deal as a concept actually existed for about a decade beforehand, but actually putting it into government, especially led by someone who it was as famous of a name as AOC, the whole point of that was just to push climate change to the front of American politics, which it did. It created a sustained conversation on the issue from all sides of the aisle, whether it was praise or criticism. And that criticism was often backed up by a lot of Republican and conservative and centrist lawmakers being forced to come up with their own solutions to climate change to counter the Green New Deal. So, not long after this was announced, a Republican senator from Tennessee pushed forward proposed his own idea of a counter Green New Deal that included significant R&D into green energy, utilizing electric cars and solar power, and investing into green buildings and weatherizing our infrastructure. And then you had more Republican senators, specifically John Cornyn, our Texas senator, but also Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and Cory Gardner of Colorado, all of whom are in tough re-election battles right now. All proposed their own version, their own conservative version of a Green New Deal. And that was the point. Addressing climate change will require a multifaceted approach. There's no one solution to this. There are going to be, progressive and liberal solutions and conservative and more libertarian. They are all addressing the same issue, and they're all trying to address the issue of climate change. Now, the other major point in the last 5 or 6 years was the Paris Climate Agreement. So I'm sure you've heard of it. It's a very famous agreement that was negotiated in 2015, 2016. And the goal of it was to limit the temperature increase globally to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, this was done through a coalition of 196 countries, which is one of the largest sustained and largest cooperation among the world's countries to address a single issue in pretty much the entirety of the United Nations history. So in order to address the 1.5 degrees Celsius benchmark, specifically, it was done by having participating countries work within their domestic politics to lower emissions. And this was done by, every year they would submit NDCs, which are just essentially emissions reports. And then every 5 years, all 196 countries would come back together and they would reevaluate and readdress their plans to make them more aggressive for the next 5 years. So it creates this kind of falling up effect. And the reason that this is such a big deal is because, first of all, a 200 country coalition is incredibly impressive. That the diplomatic side is pretty amazing, and I don't understand how a handful of people put it together. But international climate plans have been so elusive in the past because of two main problems. The first being coordination among all the nations, and the second being defining who's going to pay for it. So the Paris Climate Agreement addresses both of those issues. The coordination aspect, so the coordination aspect is difficult because every country has its own, its own emission, releases its own amount of emissions. And so there's a lot of trouble dictating who is going to reduce their emissions the most, who's going to do it first, who's going to take the brunt of the economic downfall of this, because reducing emissions is bad for business. It requires short-term losses in order to achieve long-term goals. And that's just not how economies function, especially if you are a politician who's trying to gain re-election within the next 4 to 5 years. The second part of defining who's going to pay for it, the Paris Agreement addresses this by having, well, the issue comes from, is it the already developed countries, the rich countries who have emitted most of the emissions in the past, or is it the developing countries that will make up the bulk of the share of the upcoming emissions in the next century? So the Paris Agreement addresses this by having countries like the United States and China and India taking up most of the initial damage, or most of the initial economic downfall, and then allowing smaller countries to make up where they can. Before the Paris, what would happen essentially is smaller countries would just kind of sit around and hope that big countries do their part. But Paris managed to get past that. So the main ways that we addressed this problem was, like I said, through NDCs, which fixed the coordination issue. They were very lenient. All of this is essentially voluntary, and there is no, the way international politics functions, there's no way to enforce this. The UN is not a world government. It's more of an organization of countries that just hang out and talk. And this is essentially a pledge. And so this, by making it more lenient, it allowed more countries to be included into the agreement. The other way that it addresses who will pay for it is there was the creation of the Paris Climate Fund, which was just a big pot of money that was then dispersed among the poorer nations of the world, that allowed for the investing of infrastructures, that was more climate resilient, and then just investing in more green technology in general. So in November of 2016, Donald Trump won the US election. And 6 months later, he stood in the Rose Garden and announced that he was going to be withdrawing the United States from the Paris Accords. Now, this is bad for a number of reasons. The first reason being that, well, first of all, the United States has not actually left the Paris Climate Agreement. When it was negotiated, Barack Obama and John Kerry included a provision that anyone who leaves wouldn't actually, it's a process to withdraw, and wouldn't actually leave until the day after the 2020 election. He did this just in case Donald Trump would win. So we haven't actually left yet. But the reason that Donald Trump wanted the United States to leave the Paris Climate Agreement was because he claimed it was a bad deal for the United States. He said that we would experience most of the economic pains of this, whereas big polluters like China and India would essentially be able to get off scot-free and be able to take advantage economically of the weakened position the United States would be in. That's not true. As we talked about earlier, things like the NDCs and the Green Climate Fund, they address these issues to prevent a lot of the economic hurt from withdrawing from Paris. But also, this is a long-term solution, and there may be, some growing pains in the beginning economically, but having a healthier planet is better for the economy in the long run. And the irony of us leaving the United States leaving the Paris Accords is that Donald Trump claimed that we were doing too much. The United States was doing too much while China and India were not doing enough. So he leaves, but then we go to Washington and there is absolutely no work being done on anything related to climate or the environment. The other great irony is that by leaving the agreement, the United States has provided cover for other countries to not meet their commitments. The Paris Agreement was negotiated with the United States being at the top, the United States leading, and by taking a lot of the economic downfall, we would prove that we're in it to win it, we are committed, and a lot of other countries would follow through. But by leaving, there is this giant vacuum of leadership at the top that essentially signals that other countries, you guys don't actually have to do this. You don't actually have to meet these standards that through the NDCs that you are planning on that you committed to. Excuse me. So because of this, the Paris Agreement is falling apart before our very eyes. And even if Donald Trump loses in November, Joe Biden wins, who plans to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, even if we rejoin, which would be greeted with welcome arms, the damage is already done. It would take probably like a month. I think the process lasts a month to re-enter the agreement, but it's been proved now that a country can leave the agreement, not meet its standards, and face absolutely no backlash, there would be no reprehension. Additionally, this makes it extremely difficult for any other future climate agreements because the presidency changes every 4 years. So any agreement that we make, any treaty, which requires a long-term solution, countries will be more hesitant to make that deal with the United States because of the uncertainty of whether this agreement will be present or if it will matter anymore after 4 or 8 years. Which takes us to the 2020 election. We're going to go over both candidates right now and their impact and their records and their plans regarding climate. So these are a couple quotes taken from Donald Trump's website talking about unleashing the potential of oil and gas production and rescinding Obama's clean power plan. Additionally, he's weakened car efficiency standards, watered down key environmental laws like NEPA and the ESA, and then has had a very corrupt EPA and has virtually gutted all powers of the Environmental Protection Agency. I think pretty sure they slashed their budget by about 60 to 70% 2 years ago. I tried to do this as non-biased as possible, but it's really hard because objectively, this administration has been one of the worst in the last 50 years regarding anything environmental or climate related. For example, talking about rescinding Obama's clean power plan. The CPP was a conservative-friendly states' rights approach to addressing greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. It would have reduced emissions from power plants by about 30% in 10 to 15 years. And it was signed off by a lot of Republican-led state governments. It would have been one of the first, or one of the largest legislations passed regarding reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And as soon as Donald Trump became president, he immediately scrapped it. and now it's dead. It's not going anywhere. And his replacement is toothless. It's a joke, to put it nicely. And then for watering down key environmental laws like NEPA and ESA, it allows for businesses to essentially cut corners, to make it short. Now we're going to watch a quick clip.
I'd like to talk about climate change. So would I. Okay. The forest fires in the West are raging now. They have burned millions of acres. They have displaced hundreds of thousands of people. When state officials there blame the fires on climate change, Mr. President, you said, I don't think the science knows. Over your 4 years, you have pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord. You have rolled back a number of Obama environmental records. What do you believe about the science of climate change, and what will you do in the next 4 years to confront it?
I want crystal clean water and air. I want beautiful clean air. We have now the lowest carbon. If you look at our numbers right now, we are doing phenomenally. But I haven't destroyed our businesses. Our businesses aren't put out of commission. If you look at the Paris Accord, it was a disaster from our standpoint. And people are actually very happy about what's going on because our businesses are doing well. As far as the fires are concerned, you need forest management in addition to everything else. The forest floors are loaded up with trees, dead trees that are years old, and they're like tinder, and leaves and everything else. You drop a cigarette in there, the whole forest burns down. You've got to have forest management.
What do you believe about the science of climate change?
I believe that we have to do everything we can to have immaculate air, immaculate water, and do whatever else we can that's good. You know, we're planting 1 billion trees, the Billion Tree Project, and it's very exciting.
Do you believe that human pollution, greenhouse gas emissions contributes to the global warming of the planet?
I think a lot of things do, but I think to an extent, yes. I think to an extent, yes, but I also...
All right, well, to be clear, asking about climate change and then responding about having immaculate clean air and water is not the correct response. Yeah, I also forgot to mention before regarding Paris that most countries as of now are not on track to reach their goals that they agreed to in 2016. Yeah, that's the effect of the United States leaving. And now we'll move on to looking at Joe Biden. A lot of people were not happy with, a lot of young people, probably a lot of people on this call, were not happy with Biden getting the nomination, specifically regarding his record on climate change. However, his plan, all of this is from his website, of the United States achieving a clean energy economy and net zero emissions by 2050, having climate resilient infrastructure, taking the lead internationally on climate change, both with Paris and beyond, and then also taking action against fossil fuel companies. All of that is single-handedly the most aggressive plan ever put forth by a major party nominee, just hands down. And that is thanks to people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, thanks to us electing a climate denier and creating the Green New Deal. The efforts of the last 5 years have culminated into this plan, which is, like I said, an extremely aggressive and extremely impressive plan. And now we'll see Biden's equivalent response at the same debate.
Vice President Biden, I'd like you to respond to the president's climate change record, but I also want to ask you about a concern. You proposed $2 trillion in green jobs. You talked about new limits, not abolishing, but new limits on fracking, ending the use of fossil fuels to generate electricity by 2035, and zero net emission of greenhouse gases by 2050. The president says a lot of these things would tank the economy and cost millions of jobs.
He's absolutely wrong, number one. Number two, if in fact, during our administration, the Recovery Act, I was in charge able to bring down the cost of renewable energy to cheaper than or as cheap as coal and gas and oil. Nobody's going to build another coal-fired plant in America. No one's going to build another oil-fired plant in America. They're going to move to renewable energy, number one. Number two, we're going to make sure that we are able to take the federal fleet and turn it into a fleet that's run on their electric vehicles. Making sure that we can do that, we're going to put 500,000 charging stations in all of the highways that we're going to be building in the future. We're going to build an economy that, in fact, is going to provide for the ability us to take 4 million buildings and make sure that they, in fact, are weatherized in a way that, in fact, they'll emit significantly less gas and oil because the heat will not be going out. There's so many things that we can do now to create thousands and thousands of jobs. We can get to net zero in terms of energy production by 2035. Not only not costing people jobs, creating jobs, creating millions of good paying jobs, not 15 bucks an hour, but prevailing wage, by having a new infrastructure that in fact is green. And the first thing I will do, I will rejoin the Paris Accord. I will join the Paris Accord because with us out of it, look what's happening. It's all falling apart. And talk about someone who has no relationship with foreign policy. Brazil, the rainforests of Brazil are being torn down, are being ripped down. More carbon is absorbed in that rainforest than every bit of carbon that's emitted in the United States. Instead of doing something about that, I would be gathering up and making sure we had the countries of the world coming up with $20 billion. Say, here's $20 billion. Stop tearing down the forest. And if you don't, then you're going to have significant economic consequences.
If any presidential nominee or any candidate prior to 2016 had any of what Joe Biden just said in their climate plan, they would have been derided as a radical left commie. This is good progress that we've made in the last 5 to 6 years. And it's thanks to, the student-led protests, both here at home and abroad internationally, of young people protesting action, for action on climate change. So this is how many people didn't vote in 2016. This is an unacceptable number for a developed democratic country. The 3 states that handed Donald Trump the presidency were Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Among those 3 states, if you combine them, the difference between Hillary Clinton votes and Donald Trump votes, more people voted third party, such as for the Green Party, which is the environmental party, than were in that difference. So if all those environmental voters have voted for Hillary Clinton, she would be president right now, and we would not have a climate denier in the White House who talks about, immaculate air or whatever. If 2/3 of Americans agree that the federal government is not doing enough on climate change, but over half of them don't vote, then it doesn't matter what they think, because their opinions are not reflected among our elected officials. If voters don't care about the environment, the government's not going to care about the environment. I mean, that's just how republics function. And that's where the Environmental Vote Project comes up. And this is my last video.
Meet Lily. She cares deeply about the planet her kids will inherit. And she knows that climate change and other environmental problems are only getting worse. So Lily does what she can. She recycles. She bikes to work, even in winter. But there's one thing Lily doesn't do that could have the biggest impact of all. Lily doesn't vote. And she's not alone. The latest research reveals that most people who really care about the environment, as many as 15 million environmentalists, simply don't vote. That's a huge problem, because by and large, politicians only care about the needs of people who vote. To figure out those needs, politicians conduct lots and lots of polls, but they only poll people who vote regularly, because only voters decide whether politicians keep their jobs. Even worse, political campaigns never even encourage people like Lily to vote because it's more efficient to just reach out to reliable voters. The end result? When Lily and the 15 million environmentalists like her don't vote, their concerns don't show up in polls, and so politicians ignore them. We have to change this for Lily and her family, for you and your family, and for the planet. That's where the Environmental Voter Project comes in. We're not a campaign, and we don't even care who gets elected. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with a simple mission: get more environmentalists to vote in each and every election. Here's how we'll do it. First, we'll use state-of-the-art data analytics to precisely identify all the Lilies out there who deeply care about the environment but are ignored by politicians. Then we'll connect with them, knocking on doors, using social media, and sending mailings, all with special messages scientifically proven to increase their likelihood of voting. Eventually, as more environmentalists vote, they'll show up in polls too, making environmental issues impossible to ignore. So what's next? Well, that depends on you. Join our movement today, and together we'll make sure that every environmentalist votes in every election. With your help, we can give Lily and millions like her a voice that just might save the planet.
So the way that just basic voting works is that, people like us, people who will go to a webinar about environmental politics at 1 p.m. on a Monday, we care about these topics, but our vote is worth the exact same as, your childhood friend who is vaguely aware of climate change and sometimes votes. It's equal, which is why not only is voting the baseline, but also encouraging others to do so as well is the baseline. The whole point of voting is collective action. But if 51% of people don't vote during a presidential election, that's just, that alone, no matter who wins, is an abject failure of the American political system. So from this, I just encourage everyone here to vote early, vote often, and to also bring someone with you to the polls, whether it's a friend, a family member, a neighbor. It doesn't matter. Just bring at least one person. So this election is pretty different for a variety of reasons. First of all, the electorate itself, the voting population, looks pretty different than it has in the past. The first Americans born after 9/11 can vote for the first time, which I thought was just an interesting fact. And there's also an unusual number of young voters this year. Gen Z will surpass the silent generation share of the electorate, which is the oldest generation. And together, Gen Zs and millennials, who tend to view politics the same way through, view things through a socially progressive and economically progressive lens, will make up over a third of the electorate. That is a huge chunk. If most young people care about the environment, if 30%, 37% of American voters say the environment is their top issue, that would completely change a lot of politicians' approach to issues like climate change. The other reason this is a weird election is because we're in the middle of a pandemic. So this is some just info about voting here in Williamson County and on Southwestern's campus. We'll have a polling location at the Robertson Center on Election Day, November 3rd, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. I'll be working there, so you can come say hi. And now, if you want to vote early, which normally I would recommend that we do that, the nearest voting location to campus, I believe, is the Parks and Rec admin building. And I provided the address there if you need it. And it's usually open from about 9 or 10 a.m. to about 6 to 7 p.m. Now, if you don't want to vote in person, which is completely understandable, mail-in ballots, the request for mail-in ballots is October 23rd, which is in 11 days. There is a deadline for submitting an application, but not for receiving your ballot. The county can give it to you like 3 days before election day. So please, if you're planning to do that, please request it like right now if you haven't already. So voting in Texas, just in general, is pretty difficult. One of my favorite sayings is that Texas is not a red state, but a non-voting state. There's a lot of reasons for this, some of them being active voter suppression. For example, there's rampant gerrymandering, but also Greg Abbott has made he's not expanded the eligibility requirements in order to receive a mail-in ballot, which is different from about 42 other states in this country in preparation for an election that will be almost entirely done by mail-in. In addition to this, he's limited mail-in drop-off points. So with all the confusion surrounding the USPS and people wanting to literally hand in their ballots just to be sure that their vote counts. There are voting drop-off locations in each county. However, as of a few weeks ago, Governor Abbott limited each county to exactly one drop-off location. Now, it was challenged in court and was briefly overturned, but as far as I'm aware right now, as of yesterday, it was reinstated. The reason this is blatant voter suppression is because in Harris County, for example, which has 4.7 million people in Houston, has one drop-off location for 4.7 million people. And then in Loving County, which is in Northwest Texas, which has 134 people, they also have the same number of drop-off locations. They don't want you to vote. Other reasons include pretty strict ID laws. I just thought this was funny. In Texas, you can vote with a gun license, but not a student ID. And in regards to turnout, Texas ranks on the bottom nationally. Now, in 2018 was actually a pretty good year. We had Beto leading at the top of the ticket, along with Ted Cruz. And it was a very contested, very public race. Yet we still ranked 42nd out of 50 states nationally. In 2014, we ranked 48. People don't vote in the state for a variety of reasons. First of all, there's been a complete failure on the part of the American political system, but also because of blatant voter suppression. In 2018, SU-specific information, we had a registration rate of 88.5%, which is like awesome, but it's significantly higher than the national institutional average. And that same year, we had about 52% voting rate on campus, which is a huge jump from 2014 and also a significant number above the national institutional rate. So Southwestern is awesome when it comes to voting, but there is always more that we can do. Now, the reason I talk about a blue Texas is because a blue Texas is a green Texas. From an objective standpoint, the Democratic Party is better for environmental issues than the Republican Party. That is just a fact. Now, there are a lot of, especially among young people, a lot of criticisms towards the party that are very valid. And, even me, like I disagree with a lot, but from a purely environmental standpoint, Democrats are just better positioned. They have actual plans regarding climate change. They've passed more bills regarding climate change than the opposite party. Additionally, just something to think about, because everything is mail, a lot of votes are going to be mail-in this year. We're not going to know who's going to be the president on election night. We may not know for days or weeks or even months. Hopefully not, though. However, if Texas flips blue, on election night, we will know who won the presidency. Texas has the second most electoral votes, second to California. And Donald Trump could win every single state he won in 2016 and lose Texas, and he would lose the presidency. That's how important Texas is. And considering that young people are 37% of the electorate, and couple that with demographic changing rapidly in Texas to more Hispanic and more urban, which favors Democrats, it is very likely that in the next few election cycles, Texas will flip blue, completely changing the American political landscape and completely changing our federal government's approach towards climate change and towards the environment. And that's all I got. So I know there were a couple questions that I saw. What kind of irrevocable damage can we expect if the US does not rejoin Paris for another 4 years? The deal would essentially fall apart more than it has now. It would be dead on arrival. India and China would not feel the need to start leading where the US has fallen. Regarding actual physical damage, like greenhouse gas emissions, as of now, we are on track to exceed far beyond the 1.5 degree limit that the Paris Agreement pointed out. And what was I saying? Oh, right, and we are expected to actually achieve up to, I think it was 4.3 degrees, which would be completely catastrophic. Yeah, so not looking great, which is why this election, again, is so important, but a lot of the damage is already done. Do I think withdrawing from Paris would have affected the difference in percentage of importance from this election, as seen in the past if COVID, the economy, healthcare weren't so heavily? Oh, I see. I think environmental issues would have been at the forefront more so this year if there weren't so many, like 3 or 4 other crises happening simultaneously. Because of Paris, because of the Green New Deal, because of all of the, the more progressive wing of the party taking up aggressive action against climate change. I think, yes, I think it would have been a more present thought. But things like pandemics, like that directly relates to climate change. With increased weather, there's more likely to see diseases, especially from the more warmer parts of the planet. So, good question though. And do I see the Republican Party announcing a solid climate or environmental platform other than we're gonna listen to the science? No. So, Donald Trump is the Republican Party and Joe Biden is the Democratic Party. Donald Trump doesn't believe in climate change. Well, he will not acknowledge climate change. Therefore, the Republican Party will not acknowledge climate change. There is exactly a 0% chance of the Republican Party coming out with a comprehensive climate plan before the election. First of all, that's just not their voter base. But also, the top of the ticket won't even acknowledge it, let alone pose an actual solution. Now there have been, but we've also seen that a lot of Republicans who go against the grain, who do not listen to Donald Trump, are then punished electorally. Donald Trump will go in and tell them, endorse their opponent, and they lose. It's happened multiple times. So people are afraid to step out of line, and that includes on climate issues. So while I mentioned people like Lindsey Graham, John Cornyn, Cory Gardner, these Republican senators who started initially proposing conservative, alternatives to the Green New Deal, they have since significantly quieted down because that goes against the party platform, and the platform is whatever Donald Trump says it is. Is it possible for environmental issues, or will it always be politicized? And anonymous attendee says, this wonderful session. Well, thank you. I'm glad that I gave you more ammunition. Thanks for coming. Is it possible for environmental issues to not be politicized? Or will it always be politicized? I think it's important to point out that the politicization of the environment is like uniquely an American thing. Pretty much all of Europe and Asia and Africa and South America, it's not a wedge issue. Climate change is a fact, it's happening. And a lot of it is because a lot of them experience it, where they have El Niños in South America, heat waves across Europe, you know, extreme winters in Asia. Like, it's just not the same. So this is a uniquely American characteristic. I'm hoping that if and when, it depends on who takes over the Republican Party after Donald Trump is gone. Because that's where the politicization comes from, is from that denial of science. But, you know, if they continue, if this becomes a trend, then no, I don't see any change in the politicization. But it's also important to understand that, like, this was literally, this being the politicization was literally funded by fossil fuel companies into think tank groups like the Heritage Foundation, where they, which is just they host like a climate summit, big, yeah, and would bring on scientists and talk about how climate change is a hoax and why it's not that big, or why it's not that big of a deal, or whatever. And so you can actually trace back the current politicization we're experiencing right now to that, like the money funneled in fossil fuel companies from the Koch brothers and things like that. And other countries just don't have that. So it's not looking great right now. But those were all some really great questions. Thank y'all for coming. I appreciate it.